Hi there. The reason that we picked a calla lily tonight wasn't so much as to do a floral, although our series we're trying to do different things every class so that you can experience different subject matter. But the reason I picked a calla lily was mainly to show you how to do a background using saran wrap. We've already done in the past the use of salt and what salt will do. We're going to use a little bit of salt again tonight. We've done dry brushing. We've used a plastic spoon to scrape out tree branches and trees. And so tonight I'm going to show you mainly what saran wrap will do for you. So what you do need to do though is to definitely have your calla lilies sketched so that you know where you're painting and you know where we're going to be using the saran wrap and where to paint our background. The calla lily is white, so a lot of your calla lily will just be left as the plain white paper. I don't paint a white subject with white watercolor paint. I will highlight with white watercolor paint, but I don't paint a subject or anything in my picture with the actual white watercolor paint. The reason being, number one, it is a very opaque paint, not like most watercolor paint, which is translucent. The white tends to be opaque. And once you put your white paint on, it doesn't want to accept another color on top of it. So white I only personally use as a highlighting tool. So we're going to start off with the area where we're going to use our saran wrap. And that area is, if you refer to your picture that you might have with you, that area is where it's just dark in color now, but I'm going to make it look like there is foliage back in there. So I'm going to use a bigger brush and I'm going to be using my sap green color. And my sap green color is just a nice sagey green. I want to paint it on nice and wet. And I want to make sure that it is going to stay wet. So in order for that to happen, you have to keep dipping into your paint. Don't try to stretch your paint too far, meaning don't stretch it and keep pushing it with your brush until you hardly have any paint left on your brush. Because what will happen is that area will start to dry because it's so thin with paint, and the rest of your area will still be wet. When you go over wet paint or dry paint with more wet paint, you will get a double layer of paint. And that will also show where all your lines are that you have painted, all your brush strokes. So when people ask me, how come your background can look so smooth and you see all my brush strokes? That's why, because the paint is already drying. And when you go back over it like this, you are putting a second wash on. You are putting more than one wash. But if you see how I can do that and my paint is so wet, I'm not getting a second coat. It's all just blending in as one similar coat. Now I'm going to add a little bit of indigo. You could use black if you prefer, but I'm going to break up that color while it's still wet. And I'm going to just add some strokes of indigo. I'm really not planning so much where that's going, I'm going to let my saran wrap decide that for me. So I'm just adding in a little bit of indigo color. And then you're going to take just a regular piece of saran wrap, regular plastic wrap. And you're going to lay that over the whole area that you've painted. And you want to move that saran wrap around so that you can actually see some markings on your paper. And those markings is what your saran wrap will create for you. So you can manipulate it how you want. If you want it to look like something in specific, like a specific big leaf, or if you don't care and you're just pulling out some shapes, which is what I try to do. And then what you're going to do with that is you want to lay something flat on top of this to hold your saran wrap in place. It doesn't necessarily have to be something very heavy, but it should be something that will hold your saran wrap in place. I usually just slide mine under my palette. So I'll just lift my palette up, slide this under there for a couple minutes until it dries. In the meantime, I have already done one so that I can show you what it will look like. Before you take your saran wrap off, you don't want to just rip it off. You want to make sure that your shapes have actually set and somewhat dried, because if they haven't and they start to move back into all one color, then you want to replace that saran wrap and allow it to dry a little bit longer. You're usually looking at about 10 minutes for it to really set and be in place. So mine is set. I'm going to remove my saran wrap. And now you can see, you have a nice view of what that saran wrap has done. And it does make it look like there's some leafage in your background. Now, you have your options. You can leave it as is and do nothing with it, or you can start to outline some of your leaves or whatever you're doing with it and make it pop out a little bit more. So I'm going to show you that also while the other one is drying. I'm mixing a little bit of sap with my black, and I'm just going to go up and I'm going to pull out an area. And then I'll soften that edge with some water. I'm going to use this as another leaf. And this is the stem. And you are just going to continue to do that, pulling out different shapes that you might see, using them as leaves or using them as just a textured background, whatever it is that you would like it to be. the coloring that you put on to separate your leaves out, you can salt that color. You can deepen that color. I'm going to go ahead and deepen this in here between these two. So now you can see what you can do with your saran wrap. Like I said, you can leave it as is, depending on what your style is, or you can outline and deepen behind that saran wrap to make your leaves or whatever you're doing with it more visible. And the nice thing about it too is you have time that you can kind of plan what you want to do with it. Because once you take that saran wrap off, then you can see where the markings are and what you want to do with it. It's not something that you have to figure out immediately and start painting. So this is for bigger areas that you want to cover. I wouldn't suggest doing the saran wrap on small little areas, only because if you try to squish your saran wrap into one small area, you're not going to get these nice big lines. You're going to get more of a crumpled look. But that might be what you're looking for a certain thing. Okay. So we're going to just test this and see how our main picture is coming here. It looks like my saran wrap has begun to work well. And I should be able to take my saran wrap off. Because it's still a little damp though, you can see it's still a little bit wet. I'm going to dry it quickly with my hair dryer. Okay. So now you want to decide where you would like to put in some leaves. You can make these as big leaves because it is a calla lily and they have more of a larger leaf, or you can choose to do something smaller. It's up to you. This is your painting. You can do however you would like with it. I'm going to just pick out maybe one or two big leaves from this. And I'm going to start right here and take it up this way. And I'm just going to soften my edge with plain water. And then I will pull another leaf out down this direction. And then I'll put a nice wash over this texturing just to pull out these two nice leaves right here. Okay, so you can see how all you have to do is just put a wash on there and that'll pull out your other leaves. Okay, now as far as the rest of this down here, if you would have chosen to, you could have certainly made this entire area all like this. But I'm going to actually make it look like this table or this flower was on a table, only so I can show you this little piece of vase over here. So what I'm going to do first is, because I'm working with my greens, I'm going to go over here to the vase. In your picture, the calla lily is the main thing. So your focus is on the calla lily. But there is some greenery in this vase. The greenery in the vase, though, is very muted and blurry because the camera did not focus on that. And I don't want my eye to focus on that either. So I'm going to just wet the vase with water, plain water. And anytime you're doing anything with plain water, when I say wet something with plain water, it has to be plain, clean water. It can't be the water that you're rinsing your brushes in, because even if it's very pale color, it will still show up on your paper. Now I'm going to take that same green that I was working in, and I'm going to just brush that through my vase, because that's going to make it look like there's a leaf down in there. And I'm going to brush it through up in here also, because that water is reflecting some of that green. And I'm going to let it just follow the water and do what it wants to do, because watercolor will follow where it's wet. If you turned this and made it start to move, made the color start to move, if it hit a dry area of paper, it would stop abruptly at that line. So if you want to allow your paint to flow, you have to give it the water to flow in. It will not go where it is not wet. Okay, so back in here, this area back here is actually a leaf. So I'm going to paint that leaf in just regularly now. I'm not going to paint it in, or I'm not going to cellophane that one in. I'm going to paint it in as a nice dark leaf. Again, anytime you are working with watercolor, it is watercolor. You need water for this paint to work and react like you want it to. If you don't give it the water, it's not going to give you what you want, which is a nice smooth paint, a nice smooth stroke. If you don't do that, then you aren't going to get the result that you want either. Watercolor will not go where it is not wanted. And if it's dry, it's not wanted. It needs that water to go and flow where you want it to. Now this little part of the leaf that is turned over, I'm not painting this dark yet. So I will wait until this is nice and dry, and then I will paint that turned over part of my leaf just slightly lighter. Okay, so now I have this nice dark leaf painted in. I'm going to put a little bit of wet, dark black paint. This is very watered down, but I'm going to put that along the edge just to help separate that out from these lighter ones here. Okay. I'm going to dry my picture really well because I want to start to work on the inside of my calla lily now. So I have to make sure that all of this is dry, because if I would touch my wet paint from the inside of my flower over to this wet paint over here, they would all start to blend together. That green would now have a new pathway to come into my flower, which I don't want that to happen. So I am going to dry it well and not give it a pathway to go. Okay, so we're going to start with the inside of the flower. If you refer to your picture, or if you look at your picture, you will see that in here it is real dark green, but it also has a soft edge to it. It's not a hard circular edge. So in order for that to not be a hard circular edge, we are going to wet it first. So when you wet it, I'm wetting it with clean water, and I am wetting only where I want my paint to go. I don't want my paint to go on here, so I am not wetting that. I don't want my paint to go on this little white triangle, so I am not wetting that. I don't want my paint to go on this curled edge, so I'm not wetting that either. I'm only wetting this area where I want to give my green the pathway to move about. And then I'm going to mix my sap green, which is that same green that I've been using. And I am going to paint all along this edge. And you can see how my paint is already moving. It's following the path that I gave them, which is the water. Now I don't want it to go too far, so I want to keep an eye on how far it's going to go. If your paint looks like it's going to go too far, just simply wet your brush, rinse it off, dab it on a paper towel, and you can tame it back in. Kind of corral your paint. Okay. Now what I want to do though is down in the center, way down where it meets the center of the flower, I want to get that a little bit darker. So I'm using just a little bit of watered down black, and I'm putting that right here in these two triangle areas where I want to show the depth of that flower. So I'm putting that color in down there, allowing it to bleed into the wet green. And I'm just going to allow that to dry. So you'll see now where you have that depth coming out from deep down in that curled section of the calla lily. And you've given your paint the route to move because it has been wet. Now I'm going to do the same thing on this bottom part of the flower, and I'm going to be wetting that, but I'm going to wet that with a very, very pale yellow. It's very pale, instead of using my plain water. And then down at this base, I'm going to mix some of my yellow with my sap green to get a real pale yellow green. And I'm going to use that color to put in along the base down here. This is the area where it's going to meet up with the stem. And it has a little bit of a more of a green tone than the yellow tone. So I'm putting that in. Again, this is all wet. So I'm allowing my color to move about because it's wet. I gave it the route to go. If it wasn't wet, it would go no further than where I actually put it. Okay. Now, while all of that is drying, I am going to go down actually, and I'm going to put in the color that I want for my table. Now, if you choose to do everything as foliage, then you don't have to do this part. You can go get a glass of wine or a cup of coffee. But otherwise, we are going to put in the color of the table. And I am using burnt sienna this evening. Burnt sienna is a nice warm brown color. It almost has a little bit of a reddish tint to it, but it's not red. It's certainly still brown. And again, I want it to be nice and wet. Anytime you are using watercolor, nice and wet. Frequently dip back into your paint. Don't try to stretch your paint and have it cover the entire piece of paper. The more times you dip your brush into your paint, the smoother your edge will be, the smoother your paint lines will be. So you want to make sure that you are dipping into your paint often so that it has a nice flow to it. Also, I have a lot of paint in my palette sections. I use tubed paint versus caked paint. And so I put a nice amount of that tubed paint in my areas of my palette for my paint to be, so that I don't have to go and look for it if I'm halfway through and then all of a sudden I don't have enough paint. One more spot. And I didn't forget about this little fold over from my leaf. I will get to that. So now I have my leaves pretty much finished. I can deepen some later, and I'll even show you how to do a positive negative type thing where you can actually make another leaf back in here even though you've already painted it. I have my table color put in, and I'm going to dry that now so that we can start on the inside of the calla lily. Okay. Now I didn't forget the inside of my vase here. My vase is clear glass. So because it's clear glass, I am able to see my table color through that. So I'm just going to go down to my vase and I am going to put some of that table color into my vase, and I will just wet that off with a little bit of plain water. Because again, this is more of a subtle type of thing. This isn't a real detailed vase. This is just kind of out of focus, which is what we want, because we want our main focus to be on the calla lily. And I'm going to show you what to do with your vase to make it look a little bit more like a vase as we get closer to the end. But now you can see that now I'm looking through that clear glass and I see the table through the glass. Okay. So as I said to you, I'm going to show you real quickly how you can make another leaf come to life out of this background. All you have to do is deepen your color deeper than this. You can follow some of those saran lines, or you can make your own. And this is going to be my additional leaf. And all I have to do now is blend off this color. And there you go. Now you have this leaf, this leaf, this leaf, and this leaf. If you don't want additional leaves, you don't have to. But now you have some color variations for your foliage. Okay, so now we're going to go back here and we're going to start to center on this nice big calla lily. And what you need to do to center on that calla lily is we're going to re-wet some of this to put in that nice big shadow that's on the inside. When you do that, you don't want to use any of this. You want nice clean water. So I'm getting myself some clean water. Because when I re-wet the center of my flower here, I don't want to re-wet it with dirty water. That's a big no-no. Okay, so in here, there's going to be a nice shadow. And that shadow is going to be a hard shadow here where the calla lily leaf folds. But it's going to be a soft shadow down here where the petal is flat. Okay? So I want to wet this area up in here. This is where my shadow is going to be. And I want to only wet it though to this hard line that I want to keep as a hard line. I don't want my shadow color to go beyond that over here, so I'm not wetting that. Otherwise, I'm wetting this whole area because I want my shadow to be in here. This is going to be a soft shadow, meaning I am going to manipulate it with my brush, and I'm only going to allow it to go where it's wet. Okay. I'm using watered down black for this shadow. And I am going to bring it down this way. I know you're gasping, but this is what you need to do, because this is going to help to form the shape of your calla lily for you. You can already see how your calla lily is starting to show the depth and the curvature of its petal. And that is all just by this nice shadow that you just put in there. This is my soft shadow. This is my hard shadow. I don't want anything over here. I only wanted it to be softened here. Okay, so now we have that nice soft edge shadow. And because I gave it the water to go to, it softened itself because it met up with that water and it softened its own edge, which is exactly what you want. Okay. Now, there's going to be additional shadows, but I'm just trying to do one at a time. Number one, not to overwhelm anyone and have you try to do your entire flower at one time, but it's easier to manipulate if you're only doing one part at a time. This part here is actually the underside where it's flipped over. So that's going to be a total shadow. So I'm just going to use my watered down black and paint that in. I don't have to wet it first because I am not allowing it to go anywhere, and it's a hard shadow. It doesn't have to soften the lines. It's just a nice dark shadow because it's the underside of this petal. Perfect. Same thing up here. This is a nice shadowed piece, but I'm going to lessen the intensity of that shadow. It's not going to be quite as dark as that underneath, only up at the top part. And after you get your initial wash on, which is a lighter wash, and I'm leaving a curled lip, nice and wet. And while it's wet, then I'm going to get a little bit of my more intense color that I used down here. And I'm going to put that in up here and allow it to soften its edge because I've already wet it. And I've wet it with the lighter of the colors. Now we have this nice soft shadow in here. We have this nice heavy shadow here. We have a nice soft shadow here, but it deepens as it starts to curl around, which is here. Now we want to dry this. You never want to try to do any painting over an area that is almost dry, because what will happen is you will get a washback. And a washback is when your paint touches an almost dry surface and then pushes that paint out of the way and you get a nice big water spot. So you don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do, I'm going to soften this right here, take that out. And then I'm going to dry it again with my hair dryer. My hair dryer is my best friend because that hair dryer allows me, who doesn't have a whole lot of patience, to get things done quicker. Okay, now I'm going to re-wet this area of my flower now because there's a nice shadow on this area also. So clean water, make sure you always are using your clean water. And what I'm going to do, because I have a nice shadow here and here, I don't have any shadowing here. So there's no reason for me really to wet over there. So I'm going to just wet the lower portion of my flower. And if you go outside the lines with your water, then your shadow might go outside your line. It's going to follow the path that you give it. And the path that you give it is the water. So you want to be careful too when you're putting that water on. You don't want it just to go everywhere. Okay, so I have this nice and wet now. And if you look at your picture, you'll see that there's a couple spaces, especially where the flower folds here, that is picking up more light right here because it's raised up a little bit. So that area, I'm not going to put as much of a shadow. I'm going to go around that area. And I'm going to put my shadow here. And if you look at your picture, you'll see exactly where you want to put that shadow. The picture tells you, you don't have to figure it out for yourself. And then with my nice clean brush, I will go ahead and soften this edge so that I don't get any hard edges there. Okay. So now I have my nice shadowing in here. I have my shadowing out here. And the next thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be working on our stamen in here. That is done with a nice yellow-orange color. And once you put that nice yellow-orange color in, it is going to get a little bit of a shadow on it because it's not a bright orange color. Okay, so I'm painting it my yellow-orange first. And I am going to be using salt on this because I want to give this some texture. So in order for me to texture it, I am going to use salt on this. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with what salt will do, your salt will land on the wet paint and it will pick up the paint with each little particle of salt that you put on. And it sucks it right up into that little salt piece and it creates a texture that you will see in a few minutes on that stamen. Now, while we're waiting for that salting to work, because it doesn't happen immediately, we're going to paint in our stem. And while we paint in that stem, while it's wet, I'm going to go ahead and shadow it also. So my stem gets painted in with that sap green. I deepened it with a little bit of black. And while it's wet, on the underside of my stem, I'm going to just run a little bit of black down that stem. And because it's wet, it will go ahead and soften itself right in the wet coloring. Okay. Now, if you would have forgotten to put your shadow on and your paint already dried, all you have to do, it's very simple, is just re-wet it, and you can re-wet it just with plain water, and then just put your shadow on and it will just flow into the water. Because most of your coloring is translucent, it's not going to affect it at all. Okay. All right. Now we're also going to use a fan brush this evening. And a fan brush is simply a brush that looks like a fan. There are different types of fan brushes. There's a watercolor fan, there's an oil fan, there's all different kinds of fan brushes. I want to use the watercolor fan for this specific picture because a watercolor fan is very soft. An oil fan is much stiffer. It doesn't want to bend, it'll bend this way, but the pieces don't want to bend. And that's good for splattering or for doing harder lines and texturing lines. But for tonight, I just want to use my watercolor fan. And I am dipping it in a little bit of very watered down black, because what I'm going to do with this is I am going to make my nice soft ripple lines in this. And I'm going to follow this and I'm going to take it down like this so that it's helping my eye to understand that this came from the inside and it's folded out. If you want to do some additional ones, you can. And we could do it as soon as that dries. We'll do some over here. If you wanted to do some over here, you have to follow the way the leaf is going. So if my leaf is going in this direction, then you have to follow in that direction. If you want it to come up and around in this direction, then you have to do that with your brush. And you can see what it will do there. And you can see the nice lines that it's made. You could certainly paint them individually, but I really think that this is much easier, takes less time, and then you are at the same angle with every one. I'm going to also use this to put some lines on my table to make it look like I have some wood grain in there. So again, you have to follow in one direction how you want your lines to go. So my table's going in this direction. I'm just going to add some wood grain. Don't get carried away. You don't have to do it everywhere, but you want to do enough that it's understood what it is. Okay, that seems to be enough for me. Maybe a little bit back here. And again, but you want to go at the same angle. You don't want to change your angling. Now, where my flower has flipped over, where the leaf has folded over here, and where my petal has folded over, I'm going to paint my leaf first, and I'm going to paint it lighter than the actual. I'm painting the underside lighter. On this, the underside is still going to be white, but I'm going to shadow just a little bit of this. And then with clean water, I'm just going to soften the edge a little bit. Okay. Now make sure I'm dry enough. Dry it real quick so I can do some of these lines over here for you. And then we're going to go to the vase and finish this up. Okay, I'm going to brush off my salting and I will show you up close. You can see what that salting did. Do you see the texturing from the salt? So it makes it gives a little bit of a texture to that. Now I also don't want that to be quite as bright as that is. So I'm just putting a pale shadow on that. Not real dark, but just pale enough. You still can see that it's a color, but it's shadowed a little bit. And I'm also doing the same with this little piece of flower inside that curl. Okay, go back to my fan brush. And now you're going to do the same thing that you did over here, but now you have to follow the shape of the flower. So I have to go down into this and up and out. There you go. Perfect. Now we want to make this vase a little bit more visible, and you want to make it look a little bit more like a vase. And to do that, all I'm going to do is show you the shine on the vase. And the shine is made with my white. Like I said before, I don't paint anything in with my white, but I use my white as a highlight. So my white paint, I always keep separately. I keep it on a separate container because I don't want it to get mixed in with any of my other paint. So I'm going to wet my white paint, and I'm going to use that, as I said, as a highlight on this vase. By using it as a highlight, I'm also separating it out from the table. So I'm just putting a couple little lines of my white on there. The shape of the vase. And I'm going to go up here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go along the rim. And this is what you call dry brushing. When you hold your brush on its side, lay it on its side, and just drag it across your paper, you're not going to get a perfectly smooth line. You're going to get a rough textured line, which is exactly what I'm looking for to show the top of the vase. I'm going to show a little bit more of the top of that vase. This also will show where the vase starts to curl down and go into the neck. And that's all I'm doing on my base. I'm not doing any more because I don't want to overshadow my flower. That's my main thing. Last thing that I'm going to do is just along the underside of that stamen. I'm going to put a little bit of a shadow. And I'm going to soften it with a little bit of water. So this one was a little bit of an easier one for you. I hope that you enjoyed this one. And I hope that you learned something with the cellophane. This is a great tool. I love the cellophane look, especially for foliage. It's probably not something that you would want to do on someone's flesh if you were painting a person, but it's great for foliage. This again is the same thing that we did, how you can highlight and manipulate your leaves. And now you have a great painting. I hope you enjoyed it.